Welcome to the channel. Get ready to hear the most tragic and based on real events story. You will remember it for the rest of your life. And before you start the story, subscribe to the channel and put a like to not miss our other videos. Let's go to the video. The city of Doncaster had a reputation nestled in the heart of a state that was still struggling with its legacy of segregation. It was known for its deeply entrenched racial divides, particularly between its wealthy white suburbs and the poorer, predominantly black neighborhoods on the outskirts. When David Montgomery was elected as the state's first black governor, it sent shockwaves through the political landscape, signaling what many hoped was a new era. Beneath the surface, there were still men like Officer Brad Turner, whose views on race had not shifted with the times. Brad was a well-known figure in the Doncaster Police Department. He was built like a linebacker with broad shoulders and a steely glare that let everyone know he meant business. He'd been on the force for nearly 15 years, and in that time he built a reputation as a non-nonsense cop who didn't hesitate to enforce the law even when it meant stepping over the line. Among his colleagues, he was admired for his toughness, but there was an unspoken understanding that his methods were often tainted by his prejudices. On sunny afternoon, Brad was patrolling the affluent neighborhood of St. Clair. It was a quiet, pristine place where the lawns were perfectly manicured and the houses looked like they were straight out of a magazine. Brad's cruiser moved slowly along the street as he scanned for anything out of the ordinary. That's when he spotted him. A black man walking down the sidewalk, dressed in casual clothes, seemingly out of place in the upscale surroundings. "What's this guy doing here?" Brad muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes as he turned the wheel to pull up beside the man. David Montgomery, unaware of the looming presence of the patrol car, was simply enjoying a rare moment of solitude. As the newly elected governor, his life had been consumed by meetings, speeches, and endless appearances, and for the first time in months, he had a few hours to himself. He had decided to take a walk through St. Cla, where he once lived, before moving into the governor's mansion. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked nothing like the powerful man he was. Brad stopped the car and got out, his hand resting on his holster as he approached David. "Hey, what are you doing around here?" Brad barked, his tone immediately aggressive. David turned, surprised at the hostility in the officer's voice. "Excuse me," he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I asked you a question," Brad snapped. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "I'm just walking," David replied calmly. "Is that a crime?" Brad's eyes narrowed further. He didn't recognize David, and the fact that a black man was walking around in this wealthy neighborhood was enough to make him suspicious. "You got ID on you?" David sighed, realizing where this was going. He had dealt with situations like this before, but it never got easier. "Don't have to show you my ID. I haven't done anything wrong." Brad stepped closer, his hand tightening on his belt. "You better watch your tone. You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" David held his ground. "I'm not going to argue with you, officer. I know my rights." That was all it took. Brad's face twisted with anger, and in a matter of seconds he had David shoved up against the patrol car, slamming his arms behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the quiet street. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," Brad growled. David gritted his teeth as he felt the cold metal tighten around his wrists. "You're making a big mistake." "Oh yeah," Brad sneered. "We'll see about that." As Brad roughly shoved David into the back of the patrol car, he had no idea that the man he had just arrested was the governor of the state. David remained silent about his identity, unsure of how far this abuse of power would go. The booking process at the police station was no less humiliating. Brad strutted through the precinct with David Danto pushing him toward a holding cell without a second glance. The other officers barely reacted. For them, seeing Brad haul in suspects, especially black ones, was routine. Inside the cell, David sat on the cold metal bench, his mind racing. He could easily call for help. One phone call and this nightmare would be over in minutes. But something stopped him. He wanted to see how this would play out. How deep the rot went outside the cell. Brad was boasting to his colleagues, "Caught this guy loitering around St. Clair, probably casing one of the houses." A few of the other officers laughed, one of them patting Brad on the back. "Good work, Turner. You always know and something's off." As the hours passed, word of the arrest began to spread. David's staff, concerned when they couldn't reach him, started to panic. His security detail, who had been off duty, was alerted, and soon the governor's chief of staff, Clara Bennett, was making frantic phone calls. didn't take long for someone to piece together what had happened. By the time Clara arrived at the police station, the entire situation had exploded into a full-blown crisis. Clara stormed into the precinct and her heels clicking loudly on the tile floor. "Where is he?" she demanded. The desk sergeant looked up startled. "Who are you looking for?" "Governor Montgomery," Clara snapped. "Hugh's been arrested, and I want him released immediately." The sergeant's eyes widened in shock. "The governor?" Clara didn't wait for an answer. She marched past the desk straight into the holding area, where Brad was lounging, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. "Officer Turner," Clara said, her voice cold and furious. "Release him now." Brad frowned, confused. "Who are you?" "I'm the governor's chief of staff." "You've just arrested the governor of this state," she said, her words laced with venom. Brad's face went pale. "What? That's not possible." Clara fixed him with a withering glare. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Brad's mind raced as he stumbled backward. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the gravity of his mistake. He quickly moved to the holding cell, fumbling with his keys. As he unlocked the door, David stood up, stepping out of the cell with a calm that belied the fire burning inside him. He looked directly at Brad, his expression unreadable. "I told you," David said quietly. "You made a big mistake." Brad stammered, his confidence completely shattered. "Governor, I didn't know." David didn't respond. He simply walked past Brad, heading straight for the exit with Clara by his side. As they left the station, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a case of racial profiling, this was an abuse of power, and it had just been exposed for the whole world to see. By the next morning, the story had exploded in the media. Headlines screamed about the wrongful arrest of Governor David Montgomery, and video footage of his humiliating treatment was already circulating on social media. Protests erupted in front of the police station, with hundreds of people demanding justice. It wasn't long before calls for Brad Turner's suspension started to flood in. At home, Brad sat in front of his television watching the coverage in disbelief. His wife Jessica stood in the doorway, arm crossed, looking at him with a mix of anger and disgust. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. Brad didn't have an answer. He just stared at the screen, watching as his career, his life crumbled before his eyes. "You know what this means, right?" Jessica continued. "They're going to come after you. You'll lose everything." Brad finally looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't know. That's the problem." Brad Jessica said, shaking her head. "You never know. You never see past your own hatred with that." She turned and walked away, leaving Brad alone with the weight of his actions. Calls for Brad's resignation intensified, and the media was relentless in its coverage of the incident. Brad, once seen as a tough, no-nonsense cop, was now the face of racial injustice in the eyes of the public. But the deeper issue wasn't just Brad's individual actions, it was the system that had enabled him to operate unchecked for so long. At the governor's mansion, David Montgomery sat in his office, surrounded by his closest advisors. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from politicians, journalists, and community leaders, all wanting a piece of his time. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "This is a nightmare," David muttered, glancing at Clara, who sat across from him. "It's an opportunity," Clara corrected him. "This isn't just about you. It is about the system that allowed this to happen. You need to take control of the narrative before it spirals further." David sighed. "I didn't ask for this. Didn't want to be a symbol of anything." Clara leaned forward, her expression serious. "But you are, whether you like it or not, you have a chance to make real change here, David. You can't just let this pass." Before David could respond, his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was his wife, Leela. He hesitated before answering. "Hey," he said softly. "David, are you okay?" Leela's voice was filled with concern. "I've been watching the news. This is insane." "I'm fine," David replied, though the tension in his voice was palpable. It's a lot to deal with. "I know, but you're strong. You've been through worse." David closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting back to the past, back to the scandal that had nearly derailed his career years ago. A corruption case involving one of his childhood friends had cast a dark shadow over his political rise. Though he had managed to distance himself from the accusations, the memories still haunted him. "Yet," David said, his voice quiet, "but this is different." Leela paused before speaking again. "You need to be careful. There are people who will try to use this against you. You can't let them." "I won't," David promised. "I'll handle it." After hanging up, David sat in silence for a moment, his mind racing. Clara was right. He needed to get ahead of this. But how? Meanwhile, Brad's world was collapsing around him. The Doncaster police department had placed him on administrative leave pending an investigation, and the media was camped outside his house. His wife Jessica had barely spoken to him since the incident, and his children had started asking questions that he couldn't answer. One evening, as Brad sat alone in his living room, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find his uncle Richard Turner standing on the porch. Richard was a powerful figure in the community. His influence was often wielded behind the scenes. He was also a prominent member of a local white supremacist group, though this fact was not widely known outside certain circles. As Richard said, stepping inside, "We need to talk." Brad shut the door and followed his uncle into the kitchen. "I didn't ask for your help," Brad muttered. Richard chuckled. "You didn't have to. I know what's happening, and if you think for 1 second that the department or the city is going to protect you, you're dead wrong." Brad sat down at the table, running a hand through his hair. "I screwed up, Uncle Richard. I didn't know who he was." "It doesn't matter who he is," Richard said, his voice firm. "What matters is that you're a Turner. We take care of our own. There are people in the department who owe me favors, and I'm going to make sure they take care of you." Brad looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we're going to make this go away," Richard replied, "but you need to keep your head down. Let me handle it." Brad nodded slowly, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. Maybe there was still a way out of this mess. At the same time, tensions were rising within the Doncaster Police Department. Chief Marcus Evans was under immense pressure to address the growing scandal. Protesters were demanding action, and the city's political leaders were calling for an independent investigation into the department's practices. In a private meeting with his top officers, Marcus stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. "We have a serious problem," Marcus began. "The public is calling for blood, and Turner's arrest of Governor Montgomery has brought a lot of attention to this department. Attention. We don't need one of the officers." Lieutenant Harris crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "Turner's a good cop. He made a mistake, but that doesn't mean we throw him to the wolves." "This isn't just about Turner," Marcus replied. "This is about the entire department. If we don't handle this carefully, we're going to have the feds breathing down our necks, and none of us want that." Harris raised an eyebrow. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we cut our losses," Marcus said, his voice low. "We throw Turner under the bus, make it look like an isolated incident, and move on." There was a murmur of agreement from some of the officers, but Harris remained unconvinced. "You're talking about hanging one of our own out to dry." Marcus met his gaze. "I'm talking about saving the department. If we don't act, this could blow up in our faces, and I'm not going down with the ship." Harris hesitated before nodding. "Fine, but you better make sure this doesn't come back to bite us." As the meeting ended, Marcus retreated to his office, his mind racing. He had spent years covering up incidents of police misconduct, and if this investigation went too deep, it could expose everything he needed to make sure that didn't happen. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. When the person on the other end answered, Marcus spoke in a hushed tone. "We need to talk." Co-reporters, activists, and community members filled every available seat, eager to witness the trial of Brad Turner. The atmosphere was tense, with both sides of the racial divide represented. On one side, a group of protesters held signs demanding justice for Governor Montgomery. On the other, Brad supporters, mostly white residents of St. Clair, expressed their belief that the officer had been unfairly targeted. Brad sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. He glanced nervously at his attorney, a high-profile lawyer hired by his uncle Richard. The man was known for defending police officers in high-profile cases, and Brad hoped he could work his magic here. Across the room, David Montgomery sat with his legal team, his expression calm and composed, but beneath the surface, he was still seething. The arrest had been a humiliating ordeal, and he was determined to see justice served, not just for himself, but for all the people who had been wronged by the system. The judge entered the courtroom, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the facts of the case. They played the video footage of Brad's arrest of David, showing the moment when the governor was slammed against the patrol car and handcuffed. The courtroom was silent as the footage played, the sound of the handcuffs clicking echoing through the room. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Elaine Foster, turned to the jury. "This is what happens when we allow racism to go unchecked in our police force. This is not just about one man's actions. is about a culture of prejudice and abuse that has been allowed to fester for too long. Brad's attorney Tom Holloway stood up to deliver his opening statement. "We, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're seeing here is a rush to judgment. Officer Turner was doing his job. He made a mistake, yes, but that does not make him a racist. He did not know that the man he arrested was the governor. He was simply acting on the information he had at the time." As the trial progressed, witnesses were called to the stand. Some testified in support of Brad, describing him as a dedicated officer who always followed the rules. Others, however, painted a very different picture. Malik, a young activist who had been present during the arrest, took the stand and delivered damning testimony. Was there? Malik said, his voice steady. "I saw the whole thing. Officer Turner didn't care who Governor Montgomery was. All he saw was a black man in a rich neighborhood, and that was enough for him." The defense tried to discredit Malik, suggesting that he had a personal vendetta against the police, but Malik held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. As the trial wore on, tensions in the courtroom rose outside. Protesters clashed with police, and the media continued to cover every development. It seemed that the entire city was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But the real bombshell came when Jessica Turner, Brad's estranged wife Dawn, was called to testify. Jessica had been subpoenaed by the prosecution, and her testimony was expected to be crucial to the case. When Jessica took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She looked at Brad, her expression unreadable, before turning to the jury. "I didn't want to be here," Jessica began, her voice quiet but steady. "But I can't stay silent anymore." Brad's face drained of color as he realized what was coming. "For years, I've known about my husband's views," Jessica continued. "He's always been prejudiced. He's always had a problem with people who don't look like him. And it's not just him, his family. His uncle Richard Turner is part of a white supremacist group. Brad's been influenced by them for as long as I've known him," gasped Secco through the courtroom. Brad's attorney quickly objected, but the damage had been done. Jessica's testimony was a turning point in the trial, revealing the dark truth about Brad's connection to the white supremacist movement. As the trial neared its conclusion, it became clear that Brad's fate was sealed. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his connections to a racist organization had destroyed any chance of sympathy from the jury. At the same time, David Montgomery's own political future hung in the balance. The press had dug up old allegations of corruption from his past, and his political rivals, including Senator Arthur Delgado, were using the scandal to try and bring him down. David wasn't going to go down without a fight. He had spent years building his career, and he wasn't about to let his enemies take him out now. In a dramatic press conference, David addressed the allegations, admitting to mistakes he had made in the past, but dying to continue fighting for justice. "Won't let this moment define me," David said, standing before a crowd of supporters. "I've made mistakes. I've also learned from them, and I will not allow the forces of hate and division to tear us apart. We have to stand together as a community and demand better from our leaders, from our police, and from ourselves." The speech resonated with many, and despite the attempts to discredit him, David's approval ratings began to climb. He had managed to turn a moment of personal humiliation into a rallying cry for change. The jury had deliberated for hours, and now they were ready to deliver their verdict. Brad sat at the defense table, his hands trembling. His career, his reputation, his very future, all of it hung in the balance. He glanced at his uncle Richard, who sat in the gallery, his face stony and unreadable. Jessica was also there, sitting on the opposite side of the room, her expression resolute. The judge entered the courtroom, and the jury filed in. The foreman stood holding a piece of paper that would determine Brad's fate. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant Brad Turner guilty of assault, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit hate crimes." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by murmurs of shock and relief. Brad's face turned white as the reality of his situation sank in. He had lost. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order. "Officer Turner, you have been found guilty of serious crimes, who will be remanded into custody immediately to await sentencing." As Brad was led away in handcuffs, the very same metal bracelets he had used on David, a sense of finality settled over the room. Justice had been served, but at a heavy cost. Outside the courtroom, the streets were filled with protesters celebrating the Verdict for many, it was a victory against a system that had long been stacked against them, but there was still much work to be done. In the weeks that followed, the Doncaster Police Department underwent a massive overhaul. Chief Marcus Evans, whose history of covering up misconduct had come to light during the trial, resigned in disgrace. Several other officers with ties to the white supremacist group were also fired, and an independent oversight board was established to monitor the department's practices. David Montgomery, now more determined than ever, used his political clout to push for sweeping reforms in the state's criminal justice system. He implemented new policies aimed at reducing police brutality, increasing accountability, and addressing the racial disparities in law enforcement. His victory over Senator Arthur Delgado, who had been implicated in a corruption scandal of his own, was the final nail in the coffin for his political enemies. David emerged from the ordeal stronger, having faced down both personal and political challenges with grace and determination. As for Jessica Turner, she filed for divorce from Brad and began working with local civil rights groups. Her decision to testify against her husband had been painful, but it had also been necessary. She wanted to make a difference to ensure that what had happened to David and to so many others would never happen again. Malik, the young activist whose video footage had been crucial in the trial, became a rising star in the fight for racial justice. His grassroots organization grew in prominence, and he continued to advocate for systemic change in the city and beyond. And the case of Brad Turner had sparked a movement, one that couldn't be ignored. Doncaster, once a city defined by its racial divides, was slowly beginning to heal. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time there was hope. And for David Montgomery, that hope was worth every battle fought and every scar endured. He had faced injustice hidden and come out on the other side, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a beacon of change. The fight wasn't over, but it was a fight worth having.
Thank you for watching. Leave your opinions on this story in the comments. As well, you can watch our other videos.